There was a moment in the late 60s decade when music felt brighter, when sunshine pop blended effortlessly with soul, and harmonies could lift a room before a single lyric was sung. It was a sound that carried joy, elegance, and warmth, the kind that made you pause and wonder how something so simple could feel so perfect. But somewhere along the way, the world forgot the voices that helped create that feeling. This is the story of Friends of Distinction, a group whose harmonies once defined an era, yet whose legacy slipped quietly into the background. How does a group with this much talent rise so quickly, only to fade from the spotlight just as fast? Let's uncover their journey together. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of tea or water, sit back, and let's begin this story. Before the world knew their name, before their harmonies became part of the soundtrack of the late 60s and early 70s decade, the members of Friends of Distinction were simply young singers shaped by the places they came from, the people who believed in them, and the music that filled their earliest memories. Their story didn't begin on a bright stage or inside a major recording studio. It began in the quiet corners of Los Angeles, in nightclubs, rehearsal rooms, and community spaces where creativity felt like a shared language. Harry Elston's journey was already deeply connected to soul music long before Friends of Distinction took form. During the mid-60s decade, he sang with the High Fives, a group talented enough to open for Ray Charles on national tours. Those years taught Harry what it meant to face an audience that expected excellence. It taught him discipline, precision, and the importance of blending a strong lead with even stronger harmonies. When the High Fives dissolved in 1966, it left behind more than an empty space. It left unfinished potential. Harry wasn't ready to let go of what music had given him. Floyd Butler felt the same. His voice carried a warmth that translated effortlessly into soul pop, and he shared Harry's ambition to build something new. When the High Fives ended, Harry and Floyd stayed connected, determined to create a group defined by positive energy and vocal unity. But to form a new group, they needed more than a shared dream. They needed voices that could bring that dream to life. That's when two familiar names entered the picture, Marilyn McCoo and Lamont McLemore, who would go on to co-found the Fifth Dimension. They had crossed paths with Harry and Floyd during their High Fives years. While McCoo and McLemore ultimately moved in a different musical direction, their early collaboration set the stage for what would become Friends of Distinction. Their involvement created a link between the polished, harmony-driven sound of the Fifth Dimension and the more soulful, R&B-centered approach that Harry and Floyd envisioned. To complete the group, they found two incredible female voices, Jessica Cleaves and Barbara Jean Love. Jessica brought a stunning emotional clarity to her delivery, with a voice that could shift from soft to soaring without losing nuance. Barbara carried a velvet tone deeply rooted in R&B and pop, the kind of voice that made you feel like she was singing directly to you. Together, the four of them created something rare, a vocal blend built on personality rather than mimicry. Friends of Distinction wasn't an accidental gathering of talent. It was a carefully shaped ensemble built around the idea that joy could be a defining musical identity. At a time when America was navigating social upheaval and cultural transformation, their sound represented a gentler, brighter side of the soul tradition. They offered hope wrapped inside harmony. Their turning point came not from a record label or a chance audition, but from a moment of serendipity. One evening, while performing at a Los Angeles nightclub, they caught the attention of football legend Jim Brown. Known primarily for his athletic achievements, Brown had ventured into the entertainment world and possessed a keen eye for talent. He saw something immediately in their stage presence, the cohesion, the polish, the spark. He believed they had what it took to move beyond local stages. Jim Brown arranged an audition with RCA Records, and the label signed them soon after. It was a major step for a group whose sound didn't entirely fit into the established categories of the time. Motown was dominating Detroit, Stax was shaping Memphis, and Los Angeles was becoming the home of sunshine, pop bright, upbeat, rhythm-driven, and radio-friendly. Friends of Distinction would soon blend all of these influences into a style that felt familiar yet distinct. Their beginnings carried the optimism of a group on the edge of discovery. They had the harmonies, the chemistry, the look, and the ambition. They had a manager who believed in them and a label willing to take a chance. They had a sound that could cross boundaries, reaching pop audiences without losing the depth of soul. But most importantly, they had each other, four singers with different backgrounds and different strengths, united by music that made people feel lighter. Before the world heard their first hit, Friends of Distinction already knew they were building something meaningful. What they didn't yet know was how high they would rise, or how quickly everything could change. When Friends of Distinction stepped into the professional music world, it felt like the beginning of something bright. By the late 60s decade, Los Angeles had become a melting pot of creative energy, and the group entered the industry not as newcomers searching for direction, but as a polished ensemble ready to carve out a sound of their own. Their voices had already bonded through countless rehearsals, and their chemistry had the kind of ease that comes only from deep musical compatibility. The turning point came quickly after their audition with RCA Records. Once the label recognized the strength of their harmonies and the clarity of their vocal blend, the group was given the space to explore the possibilities of their sound. What made Friends of Distinction stand out was not just their ability to harmonize, but the way they brought warmth and joy into every line they sang. Their style carried the sparkle of California sunshine pop, but grounded it in the richness of soul and the intricacy of jazz phrasing. They were familiar, yet different enough to draw attention. It didn't take long for RCA to recognize that they had something with real potential. Producers encouraged the group to embrace the upbeat, optimistic spirit that had already become a core part of their identity. With Floyd Butler's soulful resonance, Harry Elston's smooth delivery, Jessica Cleave's shimmering emotional tone, and Barbara Love's warm, velvety phrasing, the group had a sonic palette broad enough to create something truly unique. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1969, the group released their first major single, Grazing in the Grass, a vocal adaptation of the Hugh Masekela hit. The arrangement was fresh, full of color, and driven by a rhythmic bounce that made listeners smile the moment it began. Their harmonies layered like sunlight over water, bright, fluid, and effortlessly smooth. When the song climbed to number 5 on both the pop and soul charts, the success didn't just introduce them to the mainstream, it announced them. The impact was immediate. Radio stations across the country added the record to heavy rotation. Audiences responded with enthusiasm, and record stores saw demand rise rapidly. The single went on to be certified gold, transforming Friends of Distinction from a promising Los Angeles vocal act into a national presence. Riding that momentum, the group released another single later that same year, Going in Circles. This time, they leaned into a more emotional, introspective tone. The ballad showcased the depth of their delivery, especially the way each voice carried a piece of the song's longing. When it climbed to number 15 on the pop chart and number 3 on the R&B chart, it became clear that their success wasn't a fluke, it was the beginning of a pattern. With 2 gold hits in the same year, RCA released their debut album Grazing, which reached number 10 on the R&B chart and number 35 on the pop chart. Their follow-up album, Highly Distinct, arrived before the year ended, marking one of the most productive and successful beginnings for any vocal group of that era. Friends of Distinction had arrived. Their sound was refreshing, their identity was defined, and their momentum was undeniable. But as quickly as the spotlight found them, the path ahead would reveal challenges they never expected. The first wave of success brought Friends of Distinction into a new world, one filled with tours, interviews, long studio sessions, and the kind of sudden attention that can feel both thrilling and overwhelming. But just beneath the momentum, subtle shifts were unfolding, the kind that eventually reshape a group's direction in ways no one can fully anticipate. After the achievements of Grazing and Highly Distinct in 1969, the group was under pressure to maintain their pace. RCA recognized that Friends of Distinction had tapped into something valuable, harmonies that felt timeless, arrangements that blended pop brightness with soul depth, and a sound that resonated with diverse audiences. With this momentum behind them, the label expected more hits, and expected them quickly. But inside the group, life continued to move in its own rhythm. During this period, Barbara Jean Love stepped away from performing due to pregnancy, a turning point that introduced a new dynamic. Charlene Gibson stepped in to take her place, bringing a different tone, different energy, and different stylistic approach. While the transition was handled professionally, any shift in a vocal group, especially one built on tight harmonies, inevitably changes the emotional center of the sound. Still, Friends of Distinction were determined to carry forward, and in 1970 they released Love or Let Me Be Lonely, with Charlene Gibson stepping in as a leading voice. The song became a major hit, climbing to number 6 on the pop chart and number 13 on the R&B chart. For many groups, a hit with a substitute member might have been a temporary fix. But for Friends of Distinction, it showed remarkable adaptability, proof that the group's core identity could withstand change. Around the same time, Jessica Cleaves emerged more prominently as a lead vocalist. She delivered several memorable performances, including the hauntingly gentle I Really Hope You Do, which highlighted her ability to blend vulnerability with vocal precision. Her rise within the group added more dimension to their sound, strengthening the layers within their harmonies. The year 1970 also saw the release of 2 albums, Real Friends and Whatever. This ambitious pace reflected both the expectations placed on the group and the pressure of the industry at the time. Between 1969 and 1973, Friends of Distinction released 6 albums, a demanding output by any standard. And while productivity kept them visible, it also brought a quiet toll. Constant recording, touring, and promotion made it difficult for the group to reset, evolve, or simply breathe creatively. Despite these challenges, the group remained beloved, especially on radio. Songs like Check It Out and Crazy Mary demonstrated the variety of their musical palette, moving fluidly from upbeat pop soul to more introspective tones. Their versatility became one of their signatures. But beneath the surface, the turning point was beginning to reveal itself. The music landscape was shifting. New genres were emerging. Pop and soul were evolving into funkier, heavier sounds shaped by social change and new production styles. Sunshine Pop, the bright, harmony-driven style that Friends of Distinction helped define, was no longer at the center of mainstream attention. Their hits continued, their performances remained strong, and fans still loved them, but the cultural tides were turning. And just like that, the path ahead began to tilt. What had started as a rise filled with confidence was slowly moving toward a more complicated Chapter 1, where momentum would be harder to maintain and where harmony alone might not be enough to stay in the spotlight. The first wave of success brought Friends of Distinction into a new world, one filled with tours, interviews, long studio sessions, and the kind of sudden attention that can feel both thrilling and overwhelming. But just beneath the momentum, subtle shifts were unfolding, the kind that eventually reshape a group's direction in ways no one can fully anticipate. After the achievements of Grazing and Highly Distinct in 1969, the group was under pressure to maintain their pace. RCA recognized that Friends of Distinction had tapped into something valuable, harmonies that felt timeless, arrangements that blended pop brightness with soul depth, and a sound that resonated with diverse audiences. With this momentum behind them, the label expected more hits, and expected them quickly. But inside the group, life continued to move in its own rhythm. During this period, Barbara Jean Love stepped away from performing due to pregnancy, a turning point that introduced a new dynamic. Charlene Gibson stepped in to take her place, bringing a different tone, different energy, and different stylistic approach. While the transition was handled professionally, any shift in a vocal group, especially one built on tight harmonies, inevitably changes the emotional center of the sound. Still, Friends of Distinction were determined to carry forward, and in 1970 they released Love or Let Me Be Lonely, with Charlene Gibson stepping in as a leading voice. The song became a major hit, climbing to number 6 on the pop chart and number 13 on the R&B chart. For many groups, a hit with a substitute member might have been a temporary fix. But for Friends of Distinction, it showed remarkable adaptability, proof that the group's core identity could withstand change. Around the same time, Jessica Cleaves emerged more prominently as a lead vocalist. She delivered several memorable performances, including the hauntingly gentle I Really Hope You Do, which highlighted her ability to blend vulnerability with vocal precision. Her rise within the group added more dimension to their sound, strengthening the layers within their harmonies. The year 1970 also saw the release of 2 albums, Real Friends and Whatever. This ambitious pace reflected both the expectations placed on the group and the pressure of the industry at the time. Between 1969 and 1973, Friends of Distinction released 6 albums, a demanding output by any standard. And while productivity kept them visible, it also brought a quiet toll. Constant recording, touring, and promotion made it difficult for the group to reset, evolve, or simply breathe creatively. Despite these challenges, the group remained beloved, especially on radio. Songs like Check It Out and Crazy Mary demonstrated the variety of their musical palette, moving fluidly from upbeat pop, soul to more introspective tones. Their versatility became one of their signatures, but beneath the surface, the turning point was beginning to reveal itself. The music landscape was shifting, new genres were emerging. Pop and soul were evolving into funkier, heavier sounds, shaped by social change and new production styles. Sunshine Pop, the bright, harmony-driven style that Friends of Distinction helped define, was no longer at the center of mainstream attention. Their hits continued, their performances remained strong, and fans still loved them. But the cultural tides were turning. And just like that, the path ahead began to tilt. What had started as a rise filled with confidence was slowly moving toward a more complicated Chapter 1, where momentum would be harder to maintain, and where harmony alone might not be enough to stay in the spotlight. By the dawn of the 1970 decade, Friends of Distinction stood at a place very few groups ever reached. They weren't just rising stars, they were part of the soundtrack of a changing America. Their harmonies floated across radio waves from coast to coast, threading their way into living rooms, record shops, long road trips, and the quiet spaces where people sought a little joy during uncertain times. Their sound carried a glow that felt unmistakably theirs. What made this moment so special was the balance they struck between brightness and depth. Few groups could take the lightness of Sunshine Pop and merge it so seamlessly with the emotion of soul and the sophistication of jazz phrasing. Their voices didn't just blend, they intertwined, each line supporting the next with a fluidity that made every song feel meticulously crafted yet effortlessly delivered. At their peak, Friends of Distinction sounded like optimism itself. Grazing in the Grass had already made them a national sensation, but the aftershocks of its success unfolded across the early months of 1970. Audiences were still replaying its infectious energy when Going in Circles swept in and revealed a richer, more reflective side of the group. These 2 hits, one full of sunshine, the other full of longing, showcased their remarkable range and solidified their presence at the center of American pop-soul culture. Tours began to intensify. They performed in major cities, appeared on television programs, and found themselves sharing stages with some of the era's most respected artists. Their shows didn't rely on flashy production or elaborate staging. The magic was in the voices, the lift of Jessica Cleaves's crystalline upper lines, the warmth of Barbara Love's phrasing, the strength in Floyd Butler's resonance, and the smooth assurance of Harry Elston. In concert, the harmonies felt even more intimate, as if the audience was being welcomed into a private musical conversation. They weren't just singers, they were stylists. Their wardrobe captured everything vibrant about the late 60 and early 70 decade: bold patterns, bright colors, flowing fabrics. On stage, they looked like the music sounded: joyful, effortless, confident. As their reputation grew, they became one of the few groups capable of drawing both pop and soul listeners in equal measure. Parents heard in their music the clarity and polish of traditional vocal groups. Younger listeners heard the freshness and rhythmic lift that reflected the era's new sense of cultural freedom. Radio programmers loved them because their songs resonated across demographics. Record labels loved them because they delivered hits. And for a fleeting but unforgettable stretch of time, it felt like Friends of Distinction might join the ranks of the decade's defining acts. They had all the ingredients: talent, timing, charisma, and a string of successful releases that made them a household name. This was their peak, a moment filled with applause, bright lights, and harmonies that felt endless. A moment when everything seemed possible, but peak eras rarely last forever. And even as their voices soared, small shadows were beginning to settle at the edges of their success. At the height of their success, Friends of Distinction appeared radiant, 4 voices wrapped in color, confidence, and harmony. To the public eye, everything looked effortless. Their songs were climbing charts, Their albums were reaching shelves across the country, and their performances carried a natural charm that audiences loved. But even at their brightest moment, small cracks were starting to show, quiet and subtle at first, like faint shadows behind a spotlight. The early 70 decade brought a shift in the cultural and musical landscape. America was changing. Soul itself was evolving, stretching toward heavier grooves, deeper funk rhythms, and the rising sound of early disco. Audiences were beginning to crave something different, edgier, grittier, more socially charged. The gentle optimism of Sunshine's soul, the very foundation of Friends of Distinction's style, was no longer positioned at the center of mainstream demand. Record labels, including RCA, were watching these changes closely. They began redirecting resources toward acts whose sound aligned more naturally with the new direction. Friends of Distinction, with their warm harmonies and polished arrangements, suddenly seemed like artists slightly out of step with the shifting market. Not outdated, just misaligned with what radio programmers increasingly prioritized. Inside the group, the pace was becoming difficult to sustain. Releasing 6 albums between 1969 and 1973 kept them constantly on the move, touring, recording, rehearsing, promoting. It was a workload that could exhaust even the most experienced artists. Creative burnout is often invisible to audiences, but deeply felt by performers. Every new session came with an unspoken question. Could they keep matching the standard they had set for themselves? Meanwhile, the temporary lineup change caused by Barbara Jean Love's pregnancy continued to ripple through the group. Charlene Gibson had stepped in gracefully, and her presence had even supported another hit. But the shift altered the emotional chemistry that had defined the group's earliest sound. Even when Barbara eventually returned, the delicate balance of personalities and creative instincts had changed. Vocal groups thrive on consistency, and even minor disruptions can feel larger than they appear. Competition also intensified. Groups like The Fifth Dimension, 3 Degrees, and Honeycomb were capturing major attention, often appealing to similar audiences with fresher material or stronger label backing. Friends of Distinction still sounded wonderful, but the spotlight was narrowing, moving just slightly away from them with each passing month. Still, they pushed forward. Their performances remained strong. Their voices remained steady. Their music continued to resonate with dedicated fans. But the signs were there: radio play decreasing, chart positions dipping, promotional support thinning. It wasn't a dramatic fall, and it wasn't driven by scandal or internal conflict. It was simply the slow, inevitable dimming that happens when timing, trends, and industry priorities shift all at once. For the first time since their breakthrough, Friends of Distinction felt the weight of the world tilting away from them. The applause was still there, but softer. The opportunities still came, but fewer. And the brightness that once surrounded them now carried the beginnings of dusk. Their peak had been brilliant, joyful, and deeply human. But shadows were forming, and those shadows would soon lead them into the most difficult chapter of their journey. As the early 70 decade unfolded, the challenges that once lingered quietly around Friends of Distinction began to take clearer shape. The shift was gradual, almost gentle at first, like a dimming light that you don't notice until the room has already grown darker. Their success had been bright and sincere, but the world of popular music rarely stays still for long, and the tides of change were beginning to move against them. One of the most significant forces working against the group came from outside the rapid evolution of the music industry. By the time they entered the 1973 period, American listeners were gravitating toward new sounds. Funk was rising with heavier bass lines and sharper rhythms. Early disco was emerging with its dance-driven pulse. Soul itself was becoming more socially rooted, with themes tied to struggle, identity, and political tension. The warm glow of Sunshine Soul, the very essence of Friends of Distinction's sound, simply didn't match the climate of the moment. Radio stations adjusted their playlists accordingly. Labels updated their marketing priorities. Audiences moved on to groups whose sound felt more aligned with the era's emotional and social landscape. None of this reflected a decline in the group's talent, only a shift in what the industry rewarded. Inside the group, the non-stop workload had begun to take a toll. Between 1969 and 1973, Friends of Distinction released 6 albums, a staggering pace by any measure. The constant touring, recording, and promotion left little time for creative rest or reinvention. Even the most gifted artists need space to breathe, to reflect, to evolve. But the industry's expectations didn't allow for that. When an act had early success, labels often pushed harder, hoping to capture lightning again before it faded. Fatigue crept into the process. The joy that had once come naturally now required effort. Sessions felt heavier, decisions felt harder. Moments that had once sparked creativity now carried a quiet pressure. Meanwhile, the internal shifts caused by earlier lineup changes never fully settled. Barbara Jean Love's return to the group was welcomed, but the emotional equilibrium had shifted. Vocal groups rely on instinct, the unspoken connection that allows voices to merge seamlessly. Even subtle changes in personal life, health, or artistic direction can disrupt that flow. Although the group remained professional and committed, the effortless unity that had defined their early years became more difficult to maintain. Competition also grew more intense. Acts with stronger label support or more contemporary styles were filling the charts. Friends of Distinction still produced quality music, but the landscape around them was shifting too quickly for them to adjust. By the time they reached the mid-70 decade, the crisis was unmistakable. Their once steady rise had become a slow slide. Their sound, once celebrated for its warmth and optimism, was now overshadowed by the louder, more urgent voices of a new era. For the first time, the future felt uncertain. By the time the mid-70 decade arrived, the consequences of shifting trends, heavy workloads, and fading industry support had become impossible to ignore. What had started as a gradual dimming now began to feel like a quiet, irreversible slide. Friends of Distinction were still performing, still recording, still giving everything they had, but the world around them had changed too much, too quickly. For a group built on harmony, the decline wasn't dramatic or chaotic. There were no explosive breakups, no public feuds, no scandals to fill headlines. Instead, the end came gently, almost with the same grace that had defined their music. Their releases no longer charted the way they once had. Their touring schedule, once a sign of rising success, became more demanding and less rewarding. Audiences still enjoyed their performances, but the crowds weren't as large, the radio play wasn't as frequent, and the industry attention had shifted elsewhere. The emotional weight of this period was real. The members had poured years of their lives into building something beautiful, and the thought of watching it fade was difficult. Yet they faced the moment with professionalism and dignity. When the group officially disbanded in 1975, there was no farewell tour, no final celebratory performance, not even a closing album. Their departure from the spotlight was as quiet as the shadows that had preceded it. After the split, Harry Elston and Floyd Butler continued to create and perform together for a short time. They still believed in the music, still felt connected to the harmonies that had defined their journey. But the momentum was gone, and both men eventually followed different paths outside of the industry. The dream had not vanished, but the space for it had. The years that followed brought both revival and heartbreak. As soul collectors and historians revisited the music of the late 60 and early 70 decade, Friends of Distinction began to reappear in conversations. Their songs were rediscovered, sampled, and covered by major artists. Going in Circles became a hit again through interpretations by the Gap Band and Luther Vandross. Love or Let Me Be Lonely found new life through Paul Davis. Even Grazing in the Grass resurfaced when Raven Simony recorded her own version. These tributes were a reminder that the group's work had never truly disappeared. It had simply waited for the world to find it again. But the reunion that might have reignited their legacy never fully materialized. In 1990, Floyd Butler passed away just before he and Harry Elston planned to bring the group back together. His death marked the end of the original partnership that had anchored Friends of Distinction from the beginning. Jessica Cleaves passed on the 2nd of May 2014 at the age of 65. Harry Elston passed on the 4th of March 2025. Their departures left Barbara Jean Love as the sole living original member, a bittersweet reminder of how time can narrow even the brightest harmonies. The decline of Friends of Distinction wasn't a fall. It was a quiet fading, shaped by timing, circumstance, and the natural evolution of music. But even in their silence, the echoes of what they created continued to resonate, proof that some voices never fully disappear. Long after their final charting single faded from radio rotation, the legacy of Friends of Distinction began to take on a life of its own, quietly, steadily, and often far from the places where their music first flourished. What had once been seen as a bright, cheerful contribution to late 60s and early 70s soul slowly transformed into something deeper, a reflection of a moment in American music when harmony and optimism could still shape the emotional landscape of a generation. For soul historians and collectors, Friends of Distinction represent more than a vocal group. They embody a subgenre, sunshine, soul that blended joy with craft, polish with warmth, and vocal unity with musical sophistication. Their songs captured the emotional climate of an era defined by change. At a time when the country was navigating social tension, cultural upheaval, and shifting values, their harmonies offered listeners a brief escape, a reminder that music could still feel light without being shallow. Grazing in the Grass remains the gateway for most new listeners, a burst of rhythm and color that feels timeless. Its cheerful bounce still resonates at festivals, retro parties, and on playlists curated by fans of classic soul. Going in Circles, on the other hand, continues to be celebrated as one of the most emotionally rich ballads of its era. The song's themes, confusion, longing, and vulnerability give it a universality that has allowed it to transcend generations. Over the decades, their influence surfaced in unexpected places. The Gap Band and Luther Vandross brought Going in Circles to new audiences. Paul Davis reintroduced Love or Let Me Be Lonely through a fresh interpretation, and Raven Simonet's cover of Grazing in the Grass exposed an entirely new demographic to the warmth of their sound. These reinterpretations demonstrated that Friends of Distinction had created material strong enough to outlive the chart cycles of their active years. Perhaps the most powerful part of their legacy is how they continue to be rediscovered. Soul collectors often place their albums alongside the works of Fifth Dimension, Honeycomb, and 3 Degrees, recognizing the group as a foundational part of the era's pop soul movement. Younger listeners, exploring music through streaming platforms, often stumble upon their catalog and find themselves surprised by how modern, vibrant, and emotionally resonant the songs still feel. Friends of Distinction may not have achieved the long-term mainstream spotlight their early success suggested, but they carved out something more enduring, a legacy built on artistry, sincerity, and the kind of harmony that never truly goes out of style. As the decades passed, Friends of Distinction settled into a place few groups ever reach, a quiet corner of American music history, where the people who truly listen continue to find them. Their legacy didn't fade away. It simply drifted beneath the surface, waiting for new ears, new hearts, and new generations to recognize the beauty they left behind. For many listeners, discovering their music today feels less like finding something old and more like finding something timeless. In the United States, their rediscovery came through several unexpected doors. Late-night radio shows, retro soul programs, and small independent stations began revisiting their catalog, reminding listeners of the warmth and clarity of their harmonies. Music historians, in exploring the evolution of West Coast soul, often identified Friends of Distinction as one of the genre's defining voices. Fans who grew up during the late 60s and early 70s decade described the group's music as a reflection of simpler, brighter moments, memories tied to family gatherings, school dances, and long drives beneath the California Sunday. For younger American listeners, streaming platforms created a bridge to the past. They found songs that didn't feel trapped in their time period, but instead carried a sincerity missing from much of modern pop. Going in Circles struck them as emotionally direct. Love or Let Me Be Lonely felt unexpectedly contemporary. Grazing in the Grass brought instant joy. In their responses, many acknowledged something powerful, that Friends of Distinction offered a sound both refreshing and grounding, even half a century after their debut. Outside the United States, the appreciation was even more pronounced. In the United Kingdom and Japan, 2 places with deep respect for classic soul collectors championed the group long before mainstream listeners revisited their work. Vinyl reissues, imports, and soul festivals helped bring the group's music into new cultural spaces. Their recordings became prized items for enthusiasts who understood their place within the broader tapestry of vocal harmony groups. What resonates most today isn't just the quality of their music, but the emotional honesty behind it. Friends of Distinction sang with joy but never superficiality. Their optimism wasn't naive, it was intentional, an antidote to the heaviness of the era they lived in. That sincerity is what gives their work staying power. It's why people continue to return to them. It's why each rediscovery feels meaningful. Their legacy is not measured by awards or Hall of Fame inductions. It lives in the listeners who find comfort in their harmonies, the artists who reinterpret their songs, and the quiet moments when a melody from decades ago suddenly feels like the exact thing someone needed to hear. Friends of Distinction may have slipped from the spotlight, but they never disappeared. Their music simply waited for the world to listen again. When we return to the moment where this story began, the warm glow of a late 60s radio, the breezy optimism of California soul, it becomes clear why Friends of Distinction mattered so much. Their music wasn't just part of the background noise of an era. It was a reminder that even in complicated times, harmony could still feel like a form of healing. Their voices carried sunlight into rooms that needed it, and for a moment, they made the world feel lighter. Looking back now, their journey feels bittersweet. They rose quickly, lifted by talent, timing, and a signature sound that blended joy with sophistication. They made records that still ripple with color. They gave the world songs that refused to grow old. And yet, the spotlight moved on before they ever fully received the recognition their artistry deserved. Their decline wasn't scandalous or dramatic, it was simply the quiet passing of a musical era that the industry didn't know how to protect. But the beauty of legacy is that it doesn't always follow the rules of fame. Sometimes it grows in the shadows, sometimes it deepens after the applause fades. And sometimes, as with Friends of Distinction, it finds its way back through the people who refuse to let those voices be forgotten collectors, soul historians, younger listeners discovering them for the first time, and fans who remember where they were the moment those harmonies filled the air. Their story isn't just about what they achieved or how they slipped from the mainstream. It's about what remains. The emotion in Going in Circles, the joy in Grazing in the Grass, the tenderness of Love or Let Me Be Lonely. These songs still land with honesty, still carry feeling, still connect across generations. That is the mark of a group whose value can't be measured by charts alone. So here's the question for you. Do you believe Friends of Distinction ever received the recognition they truly earned? And which of their songs still speaks to you today? If this story brought back memories or introduced you to voices you didn't know you needed, stay with us, leave a comment, share your favorite track. And if you believe in giving flowers to the artists time nearly forgot, make sure to like, subscribe, and join us for more journeys into the legends who shaped our musical world. Because Friends of Distinction never truly disappeared. They were simply waiting for someone to listen again.